Saint Laurent has just placed Rose global superstar from BLACKPINK back inside one of the most recognizable luxury fashion worlds on the planet, and at first glance, it looks almost effortless. No giant announcement built around her name. No obvious attempt to turn the campaign into a spectacle. Just Saint Laurent, Rose, Storrie, Luwen, and a very deliberate visual language. But that restraint creates a much more interesting question. Is Saint Laurent quietly executing one of its smartest luxury moves of 2026? Or is this campaign simply too understated to make the impact people expect from a global star like Rose? The answer is more complicated than the title suggests, because there is no evidence that this campaign is a flop in any official or measurable sense. What we can examine is something more interesting. What Saint Laurent is actually trying to achieve with Fall 2026, why Rose is part of that picture, and why this campaign feels less like a traditional celebrity advertisement and more like another chapter in Anthony Vaccarello's carefully controlled universe. The first important detail is that this is not simply a new Rose BLACKPINK fashion appearance. Saint Laurent's official Fall 2026 women's campaign identifies the collection as being by Anthony Vaccarello and photographed by Talia Chetrit. At the same time, the newly released Fall 2026 campaign film features Storrie with Rose and supermodel Luwen. The film is only around 35 seconds long, but its short runtime is part of what makes it interesting. Saint Laurent is not trying to explain everything. It is creating an atmosphere and letting the audience fill in the rest. And that atmosphere is very different from the way celebrity marketing often works in 2026. The campaign film was directed by Vaccarello and uses Milli Vanilli's I'm Gonna Miss You as its soundtrack. Storrie takes the lead, moving through the film with exaggerated head turns, sunglasses, and an almost deliberately theatrical style that recalls the sensual attitude of Saint Laurent's older advertising imagery. Rose and Luwen appear as part of that world rather than as isolated celebrity cameos. That distinction matters, because if you look only at the headlines, it would be easy to say, Rose is back with YSL. But that is actually the least interesting part of the story. The bigger story is how Saint Laurent continues to build a visual universe where different forms of cultural influence can exist together without making the brand feel crowded. Rose brings global music and pop culture reach. Luwen brings an established fashion identity and decades of modeling credibility. Storrie brings a newer generation of screen and entertainment attention, and Saint Laurent places all three inside the same creative language. That is a very different strategy from simply putting the biggest celebrity available in front of a logo. And there is a reason Rose fits this particular universe so naturally. Her relationship with Anthony Vaccarello has already been publicly established for years. This is not her first major Saint Laurent campaign, and her connection with the house has repeatedly extended beyond simply wearing a dress to an event. We saw another important example earlier this year. At the 2026 Met Gala, Rose wore a black Saint Laurent gown created by Anthony Vaccarello, with the design drawing inspiration from Saint Laurent collections from 1998 and 2002. The look also incorporated the recurring bird motif associated with Georges Braque's The Birds, a motif that Vaccarello had also used in his recent Saint Laurent work. And Roseanne Park herself explained the significance of that relationship to Vogue. She described Vaccarello as her best friend and favorite designer, and recalled that her first Met Gala experience had been walking the carpet with him. In Vogue's behind-the-scenes video, she also explained how Saint Laurent had carried much of the preparation for her early Met Gala appearances and how the process had become more intentional for her over time. That context changes how we should look at the Fall 2026 campaign. Because Rose did not suddenly appear in Saint Laurent's world in August, the relationship had already been reinforced publicly through major fashion moments, including the Met Gala. So when she appears again in the Fall 2026 campaign universe, the move feels less like a random casting decision and more like continuity. But then we reach the question that makes this campaign genuinely fascinating. Is this what luxury looks like now? For years, the phrase quiet luxury has been used to describe a fashion direction built around restraint, quality, recognizable design without excessive branding, and the idea that luxury does not always need to scream for attention. Saint Laurent's Fall 2026 campaign does not officially declare itself a quiet luxury campaign. That is our analytical lens, not the house's official label. And that distinction is important. Still, there is something undeniably restrained about the way the campaign communicates. The video is short. The styling is controlled. The brand does not need to explain who these people are. The imagery does not depend on a huge narrative. Instead, it assumes that the audience already understands the codes. That is one of the oldest principles in luxury marketing. The more confident a brand is in its identity, the less it sometimes needs to explain. And Saint Laurent under Vaccarello has been remarkably consistent about that. Vaccarello has been Saint Laurent's creative director since 2016, and his approach has developed into a highly recognizable aesthetic built around sharp silhouettes, sensuality, cinematic imagery, and a very controlled sense of mystery. Recent coverage of his work has described the creative universe as deliberately focused and resistant to the idea that luxury needs to chase every trend. That makes the Fall 2026 campaign easier to understand. Saint Laurent is not necessarily asking, how do we make Rose go viral? It may be asking a different question. How do we place Rose inside the Saint Laurent world without allowing the celebrity to overwhelm the brand? And that is a much more sophisticated marketing problem. Because celebrity power is a double-edged sword. Rose can bring enormous attention to a campaign, but if the audience remembers only Rose and forgets Saint Laurent, the brand loses part of the value of the partnership. The objective of luxury branding is not simply visibility. It is association. The audience sees the person, but eventually the person is supposed to reinforce the identity of the house. That is why the combination of Rose, Luwen, and Storrie is so interesting. They are not interchangeable. They represent different audiences and different cultural entry points, but Saint Laurent gives them a common visual language. And there is another detail worth remembering. Storrie had already been announced as a Saint Laurent brand ambassador in January 2026. His role in the fall campaign, therefore, did not come out of nowhere either. The campaign brings together an established Saint Laurent relationship with Rose, a supermodel with deep fashion credibility, and a newer entertainment figure who is entering the luxury conversation. That is not an accidental-looking combination. But now we have to address the other half of the question. Could this actually be a flop? If by flop we mean that Saint Laurent has officially failed commercially, there is no evidence available here to make that claim. We should not confuse a campaign's restrained presentation with poor performance, and we certainly should not manufacture sales numbers or engagement statistics that have not been reported. But if we use flop as a question about cultural impact, then the debate becomes much more legitimate. Because the luxury industry is operating in an environment where every campaign competes with everything else. Celebrity announcements, TikTok moments, red carpet images, Fashion Week clips, fan edits, breaking entertainment news. A campaign can be beautifully produced and still disappear from the public conversation within hours. That is the risk of quiet luxury. Its greatest strength can also become its weakness. Restraint can communicate confidence, but restraint can also be mistaken for a lack of impact. And this is where Rose becomes particularly important. Because her presence creates a bridge between Saint Laurent's controlled luxury world and a global digital audience that is extremely comfortable turning a single photograph into a major conversation. Saint Laurent does not need to make the campaign loud if the people inside it already have cultural gravity. That may be the real calculation. And there is a subtle irony here. The campaign itself may look understated, but the casting is anything but insignificant. Rose is one of the biggest names in global pop culture. Luwen is one of fashion's most established models. Storrie represents a newer entertainment audience that luxury brands are increasingly interested in reaching. So beneath the quiet surface is a fairly aggressive distribution strategy. The image is quiet. The network behind the image is not. Personally, I think Saint Laurent's smartest move here isn't making Rose louder, it's trusting her presence to speak for the brand without over-explaining it. And that may be why the campaign deserves more attention than simply calling it another Rose endorsement. It tells us something about where Saint Laurent appears to be heading under Vaccarello. The brand is continuing to protect a recognizable identity while allowing carefully selected cultural figures to expand its reach. Rose is especially valuable in that system because she does not need Saint Laurent to manufacture a fashion identity for her. She already has one. The Met Gala gave us the heritage side of the relationship. The Fall 2026 campaign gives us the contemporary side. One connects Rose to Saint Laurent's archives. The other places her inside its current visual language. And suddenly, the sequence starts to make sense. This is not necessarily Saint Laurent trying to make Rose look like someone else. It is Saint Laurent using Rose as someone who already understands the codes of the house. That is a much stronger form of celebrity brand alignment. So, quiet luxury masterstroke or total flop? Right now, the responsible answer is that it is too early to call it a flop, and calling it a masterstroke as a proven commercial fact would be just as premature. But creatively, there is a strong argument for why the strategy works. The campaign does not need to scream Rose. It lets Rose BLACKPINK exist inside Saint Laurent. It does not need to explain the relationship with Vaccarello. Their public history already provides the context. It does not need to turn every frame into a product demonstration. The clothes, casting, music, and atmosphere are doing the communication. And perhaps that is the most Saint Laurent part of the entire thing. In an industry obsessed with being louder, faster, and more visible, Saint Laurent is betting that confidence can still look quiet. Whether that becomes a lasting cultural success is something the audience, engagement, media coverage, and ultimately the market will have to decide. But one thing is already clear. Rosé's return to the Saint Laurent Fall 2026 campaign is not interesting simply because a BLACKPINK star appeared in another luxury campaign. It is interesting because the relationship between Rose and Saint Laurent has evolved into something much more integrated with the brand's creative identity. From major red carpets to archival references, from Anthony Vaccarello's vision to the newest Fall 2026 campaign, the story is no longer just about what Rose is wearing. It is about what Saint Laurent becomes when it puts a global pop icon inside its world and how carefully that world is being protected. So now I want to know what you think. Is Saint Laurent's Fall 2026 approach the definition of quiet luxury done right? Or does the campaign need a much bigger cultural impact to truly justify all the attention around it? Drop your take in the comments. And if you found this breakdown useful, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us for more verified stories where the fashion, celebrity, and brand strategy behind the headlines matter, just as much as the headline itself.